It's another episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob, and hey, it's Thanksgiving. It's the holidays. Everybody's on break, doing things, seeing friends and family, eating probably too much food, and hopefully being thankful for some things. Little things, big things, whatever they are. Just take a minute and just be grateful, you know? I want to thank you, of course, for listening to this, checking this out. It's just something I do for fun, just talk about some movies I've seen, and hopefully that's something that interests you or puts you on to some new movies, or maybe puts you off of some movies you just probably should avoid anyway. So let's get into this. This is an episode that, as you hear this, it'll probably be December, and I try to take this time of year to look back on what I've seen and maybe some things that didn't really fit in with other films that I watched in an episode, but I've been kind of holding off and trying to find a place to put them. So here we're just going to do a grab bag. We're going to do kind of a roundup of the maybe hard to categorize or hard to talk about films from 2024. How about that? A couple of documentaries that I saw earlier in the year. Movie Pass, Movie Crash. That was one that was on Max, I know, and that talked about the rise of Movie Pass as a service and movie theaters and those companies, but also just the film industry, the movie-going industry as a whole. I think it's an interesting look at the mechanics and the economics of not even the film industry, but the distribution side of it, the exhibition side of it, and how that really works out for consumers. And how somebody trying to maybe do something cool and something new can even get kind of taken advantage of, and the whole thing can go sideways, and it just loses all focus and all good intentions. So the other documentary that I wanted to talk about is The Blue Angels, and I think this was actually on Amazon Prime, and that was one that I think, coming off of the success of Top Gun Maverick a few years ago, this seems like it was in the works since then, and it kind of has some of that vibe to it. This is really about the Blue Angels and their whole program, from how they recruit the pilots and their training and their very disciplined, strict sort of process of putting together these shows and the kind of acrobatics of it all. And then leading up to a big, event, one of the air shows that they have. I thought it was an interesting look at it. I feel like I've seen something like this before. Maybe there was an IMAX documentary 20 or 30 years ago, but this was just kind of a fresh take on it, and also something that I think it's hard to see if you haven't seen past documentaries, but it feels more energetic. It has a different sort of energy to it. And I think that conveys a certain type of, passion or engagement with this line of work, not just being in the Navy, but being the Blue Angels pilots. That's a whole different class. And I thought it was really interesting. It's a really cool look at how these men and women do what they do, and all the people involved and all of the operations that are involved with making this thing a success. And not only a success, but safe and responsible. Because ultimately it is kind of a showcase for the best of pilots and military aircraft and all that. But it is something that, even beyond that, I think it serves as a sort of an aspirational key point for maybe young people or just people who have an interest in this thing. So ultimately, I feel like, you could probably watch, a half a dozen documentaries on the History Channel or Discovery Channel or even YouTube probably, and learn a lot of the same things. This one just happened to be really well done in terms of the cinematography and the music and the editing. So I'll give it that. And speaking of something that's really different in terms of cinematography and the filmmaking style of it, I want to talk about Civil War for a minute. This is a film from Alex Garland, who's written and directed a handful of movies that I'm really just fascinated by, whether it's Ex Machina or Annihilation, even his series Devs on FX. So much kind of deeper philosophical themes that are going on in his work. And here in Civil War, it feels like it's got all of that in there. And yet I think it's kind of hung on this premise that doesn't really ring true. You know, the premise of the film is that the United States has fallen into civil war, and it's sort of a battle of power between an alliance of Texas and California. And yet those two states, I mean, look, I live in Texas. I can tell you there's a lot of things that I personally probably would understand or agree with in terms of a California state of mind, but a lot of this state does not rock with that. And that seems just really improbable that Texas and California would ever be allies. And yet this film also really tries to dance around any sort of political element to it. And this being an election year, you can't help but think, like, how do you avoid that topic in a film about this country falling into civil war? How do you avoid the actual reason? And not just, oh, this is about brother versus brother and friend versus neighbor and all that, but why? Like, I think this film tries to sidestep all of that and make it about the journalists, whether photojournalists or cameramen, the reporters that are out in the field that are trying to cover this story and get down to the truth and maybe expose some things about what's really happening. Fine, those are all interesting things to show, but don't call it Civil War then. Call it something else and make it some other place even. The idea that this is about look, this country for sure one time in history has fallen into civil war. And over the decades since then, it seems like more often than not, we get close to that line again. And so I feel like it's a thing we know about. And to kind of tell this story without telling us the truth of what you're trying to say, you know, is this a thing about, like, you know, red versus blue, left versus right, up versus down, whatever you want to call it? If that is this kind of story, that's what it's really trying to say. Well, let's say it. And I think this film just doesn't do it. And I don't know if that's because, you know, Alex Garland's not from the United States. So maybe that's something that is kind of a little bit of foreign territory. I mean, the sort of lines that things are divided by, it's not like it's a stranger to other countries or other parts of the world. It happens. And yet it's just kind of a big, like, blind spot for this movie. And I think it holds it back. Because for all the cinematography and the filmmaking tricks of it all, which feels very immersive, feels very urgent in the way that some of these scenes and the action and the suspense of these moments are captured, I think it rides on something that I'm just not clear on. And that's kind of hard to reconcile, you know, it's kind of hard to make sense of. And speaking of another film that's kind of hard to make sense of, people probably didn't understand or didn't want to understand what the hell was going on. Joker. Folie à Deux. Is that how you say it? I'll go with that. Look, this is a film that, honestly, I don't feel like I want it. Not that I didn't like the first film with Joaquin Phoenix. I thought it was great. I don't think I ever talked about it. I think that was before I started this podcast. But that was a film that I thought it was such a lightning in a bottle moment of catching that performance with that story, with that universe even. And yet it's not related to any other sort of DC superhero film or franchise or anything like that. But to be able to capture that, and, you know, part of the magic it felt like was it was only ever going to be that one film. I don't know why we needed a sequel. Maybe the idea of bringing in other elements of the DC universe, other characters, and that is kind of what happens in this film. But I think the approach here, it's hard to say like this was a well-intentioned film. This film just feels very hostile towards the audience. It feels like it's doing everything you don't necessarily want it to do or expect it to do or need for it to do even. And when it's zigging and zagging so much to try to like just avoid your expectations, I think it ends up kind of hamstringing itself, you know? And there are even gaps in the logic behind some of the characters' decisions that I feel like this film kind of got away from everybody. And yet, look, at the same time, watching it, I actually enjoyed it. I had a sense, I think I had read something that it was a musical, like it had musical numbers in it. It wasn't the type of musical that I think people traditionally expect. You know, it drew a very clear line between being a musical where the musical numbers, the performances, the songs, the choice of songs are clearly inside the character's head. It's not like West Side Story. It's not like, I don't know, Singing in the Rain, where characters are just walking down the street and all of a sudden singing to everything. There's a subtle sort of differentiation between this is reality and now this character, or these two characters in this film, have had kind of a mental break, let's say, and now they're in this song. They're in this performance, in this moment. Whether it's like a lighting change or the camera work changes or the costumes change, you know, the wardrobe. It's a very interesting way to do a musical because you're dealing with characters who don't have a grasp on reality. I think from a technical aspect, the film is great. And I just wish that, honestly, I kind of wish it just wasn't a Joker film. It wasn't subservient to DC and the Batman fandom and needs that those franchises must serve, and just make it about this guy who's mentally ill. He has some sort of penchant for violence or for sociopathic behavior, and make it entertaining, but also make it a film that tells us about the dangers of this and the dangers of ignoring this or underestimating this. I think that's what the first film did well enough, which honestly is why I don't think we needed a sequel. It pointed out like, hey, there are people who are struggling. There are people who are ill. Let's not forget about them. Let's not mistreat them. Or they may have their moment somehow, right? The sequel here, it's got some really technically proficient filmmaking in it, but I think it was trying so hard to be something other than what you wanted or expected that it ended up being just something strange altogether. So the other film I want to talk about here is a film called Twisters that I just want to talk about it for a minute because this is a film that I don't have great memories of the original Twister. I used to work in a movie theater and I remember seeing this film so often when it came out. That was right around that time. And I remember thinking it was a big deal in terms of, oh, this is the first time you've seen stuff like this on film. But when you kind of step back and look at some of the performances, some of the writing in it, and even some of the visual effects and stunts of it, it's not that great. It's a fun time, but it doesn't have a lot of meat on the bone, you know? So going into this sequel, I didn't have very high expectations. The only thing I thought might work better is that, oh, well, technology, visual effects, all this stuff with the tornadoes themselves, it's going to be way more convincing now. You know, I think this film probably relies a little too much on the relationship, the performances, the charisma of its leads, Daisy Edgar Jones and Glenn Powell. And I think it even tries to establish this like triangle type situation. And I don't know that any of that really works. That, and this film, I once heard, put it this way, I once heard about the film The Perfect Storm. You remember that? I remember someone once told me they hated that film because all everybody did in the film was shout. It's too shouty. And I didn't really get it at the time. And honestly, I don't know if I still agree. I haven't seen The Perfect Storm in a while. But watching Twisters absolutely applies. So much shouting in this movie. And it's not even shouting of characters. It's not even necessary shouting, if that makes sense. There is a thing, there's a sort of a stereotypical type of person that is a storm chaser that I think, one, is a little bit cliche, but on the other hand, is also kind of true. You go to YouTube, you look up videos, you look up these people that are like this Glenn Powell character. Was it Timur Reed? Is that the name of the guy, right? That built the big tornado truck or whatever the hell it's called. And you watch videos of him or people like him or even some amateur people who probably get in over their head. Yeah, their videos, nothing but shouting, of course, because who wouldn't be scared shitless in the middle of a tornado? Yes, okay. I just don't want to see a whole film based on that. Like, that gets annoying fast. And then the other thing of this film going beyond what we consider or what we know is reality, or the I guess the kind of understood science of tornadoes, the common knowledge of science of tornadoes. And I feel like kind of goes into science fiction. Damn near magic happens in this film. And that's where you lose me, because I'm like, all right, I can work with characters who feel very kind of homespun and down to earth, and they're just out here trying to do this, and they're kind of having a good old time. They're getting a little too shouty, but they're trying to do this thing to help people and help others, help their communities. Okay, I'm kind of down with it, I'm there. But when the climax of the film revolves around this sudden like work of magic or some kind of quasi pseudo meteorological event, like, no. You've kind of gone off the rails now. You just made everything up now. That won't happen. That doesn't happen. You don't know that happens. It's all theoretical. That's not what I signed up for. I want to see people dealing with this sort of event, this sort of natural disaster, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to see them like all of a sudden saving the world. Like, it's just, if you've ever been through a storm like that, like a tornado, hurricane, any kind of natural disaster, you're not changing it. You're not stopping it. I'm sorry. I know movies are the place for magic, like Nicole Kidman says, but come on, some things you lose me. And that's where I just kind of felt like, nah, this isn't really doing it. This is one step too far, somehow, for Twisters. So anyway, after all of those films, we're talking Twisters, Joker, Civil War. Those, I think, were, in my mind, movies that I really kind of expected to be big deals and be really well done and maybe have some sort of resonance or impact, So I said, all right, let me just back off of that. Let me look at some smaller films by maybe some different filmmakers and just simpler concepts, And boy, did I go in the wrong direction. I watched this movie Trap by M. Night Shyamalan, and that I thought, it's such an interesting premise, the idea of a man who is a father who is attending this pop star concert, but is also a serial killer, and the concert is kind of laced with security because, law enforcement, they're trying to catch this guy. And that's the way it's set up in the trailers and the promotional stuff. But, I almost feel like this film would have worked better. It would have probably played with a little more impact if you didn't know that, if that was kind of the reveal of it all. I think watching the film and knowing that ahead of time, it feels like it's playing into it. It feels a little too winking, because as the audience, you're supposed to understand like this guy is putting on a mask or a face to be like the typical dad who's looking after his daughter and wants to have an interest in whatever, the music, the event, that sort of thing, but really has a whole other agenda in mind and is also kind of operating on a different level in terms of what he's doing, what he's thinking, what he's seeing. And I think it's played so on its face that it doesn't really feel very suspenseful, If the film maybe would have taken the approach of showing this man in this mode of being a dad and attending this concert and trying to enjoy it and being mostly earnest about it, but him also carrying that sort of weight of being concerned, being maybe even afraid of what might happen at this concert. I think that would be a different energy. And that would be something that as a parent, you might relate to more versus being the man who is also the bad guy and always knowing that he's got to look for a way out or look for some other approach to his target. So I feel like the film kind of sabotages itself in terms of the sort of suspense, in the drive of it all. I think it kind of takes the wind out of its own sails. That and a couple other things about the film that I just don't feel like really made sense. And one of them is the pop star, the artist who is performing at this concert is, if I remember right, I think it's like M. Night Shyamalan's daughter who, I don't know if she's actually really a singer, performer, that kind of thing, but the depiction of it all seems fairly, authentic. And, I've never been to like a Taylor Swift or whatever kind of concert. So I don't really know if these are how these things go down. I guess it's just supposed to kind of get us there, like something similar to that. But then when this character and his daughter actually come into contact with this singer and some of the decisions that get made after that, they make absolutely no sense. And this whole thing of being self-contained in this stadium or this arena, when that spills out into the real world and the outside world, let's say, that's where I think the film, I just think it just totally loses all of its momentum. And I think it's meant to like build more momentum is right. This is a bigger picture thing now. Like this is beyond being contained, but it also kind of like just releases all the pressure, all the tension that was being built in like the first half of the movie. And it just kind of opens up into this man's family and his home life and how deep into this, serial killer life that he has gone and hidden it from his family. I think it's trying to be a couple of different movies at once. And I kind of liked the original, the kind of basic premise of it all versus everything else that followed. So I don't know if it was really that successful in that regard. So another film that I ended up watching, which wasn't entirely my choice, but it was a film that I happened to see, was a film called Subservience. And all I can say is it's a film with Megan Fox starring as this, kind of android AI type of synthetic servant person. Honestly, I don't really understand the premise of it other than it's kind of like Megan, but kind of like what, like Fatal Attraction or something. And the big takeaway for me was that I don't know what exactly is the thinking behind some of the choices. Megan Fox in this film has like zero, charisma or what's the word, chemistry with the other characters. And I get it. She's supposed to be a machine, of course, but there's like zero kind of appeal to it, honestly. This film kind of even goes beyond that. I mean, part of it is like, oh, this man who his wife is sick, he's got to take care of his daughter, and this female android servant comes into the picture and is supposed to help, but then also kind of turns into a weird surrogate, or I don't know, like sex toy or whatever. It's kind of ridiculous. But then the fact that it turns into like a just technology, AI gone wrong thing where there are other characters involved and there's like this whole criminal element subplot thing going on. It is kind of bonkers. It's trying to be a few different movies, not just two different movies. And I don't think it really works in any of those regards either. You know, I really thought these films that are kind of hung on these simple premises could be more effective at telling a story, or at least building out some interesting characters. But I think to take a simple premise and then layer other things onto it, I mean, that's a tricky thing, because sometimes simplicity is the better option. And yet I feel like it's a tendency to like want to add more to it, add more detail or nuance or other sorts of components to a story or characters or whatever. But man, sometimes simple is better. It just is. So, you know, those two, I don't look back too fondly on them either. The next couple of films that I did get to see that I really was expecting some good things out of, but also I kind of didn't feel like I really needed to see them, were Transformers 1 and Gladiator II. And Transformers 1, it was more of a matter of, you know, when I was a kid, Transformers, the movie, you know, the original animated film, that was a big deal. And over the years, all of that has kind of been, I don't know, tarnished, or I don't know, tarnished isn't a word. I don't hold it in that high of a regard, but it's just been diluted in the sense that, you know, all of the Michael Bay films that came out, and then the couple of other films that have come out since then, plus all of the animated series, the sort of spin-offs or whatever over the years, I feel like it's gotten so far away, or maybe in some people's eyes, it's gone deeper than the original animated show in the film. But to my mind, it's kind of suffered from like Star Wars syndrome. Like it's gone so far abroad in terms of characters and stories and, I don't know, universes or whatever, different versions of all these things, that it's just kind of hard to nail down anymore, like what is good about it. And so Transformers 1, I felt like it was at least a film that did try to take it back to basics and honestly just really started us over in a way. I mean, we're still dealing with some of the same characters of the original show and some of the movies, but we're taking it all back to a different period in these characters' existence, I guess, in the lore of it all. You know, some of the character design, some of the sort of humor and energy of it. It feels a little more family friendly, I think, on its face. But if you look at some of the things that are in it, like some of the themes of it, even some of the moments and action sequences of it, it's actually pretty deep and deeper than you might think. It even touches on some bigger ideas than really any of the other movies have, because it's not so fixated on things. There's no sort of just gimmicks to it all. It really is about these characters and their bonds and how those bonds develop, and in some cases those bonds break. And I think, wow, that's such a really elemental part of what makes Transformers interesting, or even quote unquote magical, you know, especially for a child. As an adult, it's kind of hard to see that anymore. But this film, I think it kind of gave me a glimpse of that again. Everything that's kind of been stripped away by all the live action movies, I think this film actually kind of re-injected it back into it for me. So I enjoyed it. I liked it. Some of the voice acting was fun and different and not exactly what I would have expected, but I think it works. It's not quite in line with voices and some of the tone of things that we've seen before, but it still feels somewhat true, I guess, emotionally or something like that. So anyway, Transformers 1, I feel like I was more pleased than I expected to be. And Gladiator 2, it's another film that I don't really think I had an interest in seeing. I don't even really think I felt like needed to be made. And yet, it's Ridley Scott. And for me, I think I've said it before in other episodes, but Ridley Scott is a filmmaker that I find so much, fascination with and admiration for his style and some of the films he's made, but also his sort of approach and not just aesthetically, but thematically, whether it's Alien or Blade Runner, or you could even say the original Gladiator, even though, I remember liking the film, but I also remember thinking, I don't know if this is necessarily best picture of the year. I think it was well done, but it didn't necessarily move me as much as I think it did for a lot of other people. So watching Gladiator 2, I kind of went into it a little skeptical, I got to admit. I think a big thing that made the first film work was Russell Crowe. And if you've seen that film, sorry if you haven't, spoilers, it's 20 years old, but his character dies. And for the hero and the sort of elevated depiction of that type of character, and for all that to kind of end with the first movie, I just thought, well, how do you replicate that or even top it? And so in this one, in Gladiator 2, I mean, we've got a new face, I think a new face to a lot of people, Paul Mescal, who, I've talked about a couple of movies I think that he's been in on this podcast, but I think for most people, he's an unknown. You might have seen him in some films in the last 5 years or so, but you may not have recognized that's who it is. You may not even connected the dots of like, oh, this is the same guy. And yet Denzel Washington in this movie, who, honestly, after like all the Equalizer films, I kind of like just not really seen him doing the kind of work that I would expect. I think he's a great actor. I think he's one of the all-time greatest actors. But I think in a lot of movies more recently, he seems to kind of like depend on a lot of the crutches and things that they just feel very Denzel-like. That's why, the tragedy of Macbeth, that was such an interesting, surprising performance, because here's something that it doesn't necessarily feel like something you would just see Denzel do in any other movie, but also it feels different. I don't know how, and it sounds like I just said the same thing. What I mean is, it feels like a different side of him that we hadn't quite seen before. And in this one, it starts off as like, okay, we're seeing charismatic, kind of swaggery Denzel. But there's a point in this film, in Gladiator 2, where his character just takes over the movie. Like literally just yanks it from everybody else, even from Ridley Scott. All of a sudden, it is Denzel's movie. And it is a really kind of startling moment. And even that, I feel like, well, we've seen Denzel play some questionable characters. We've seen him play some bad guys here and there every once in a while. But in this film, I think he really seems to give like a big, full representation. Like that range is there. When we first see him, he's kind of introduced as this sort of rambunctious, kind of questionable, was he like the gladiator master or whatever? And it just seems like he's, a little bit too cavalier, a little bit too careless, but maybe also a little thirsty for power. And then by the end of the movie, you realize, oh no, this is a man who's out for blood. And he's just been hiding it this whole time. It's really kind of nuanced if you look at it. And so I think the moment when that happens in the film, when he kind of takes over, it's like in the third act. And I just really didn't think that was going to be a part of it. And so to me, that elevates the whole film. And it's funny, you know, I did see a clip of something of a show or an interview or something where it's like, yeah, you don't really see Denzel do what it appears he was supposed to be doing in this film, which is like a supporting role. I mean, it does start that way, but that's not his bag. Denzel Washington does not do supporting roles. He is the leading man. And by the end of this movie, it's like, yeah, this is kind of Denzel's movie. And of course, by the end of the film, things happen. Maybe it's not quite Denzel's movie like it might have seemed, but still, it's a really interesting approach to kind of having this two-hander sort of structure where it's one character's movie and then another character takes over, and then it becomes like a battle between the two of them. And I think, you know, there's even something about this film that, you know, the first film, if you step back and look at it, right, it's like Russell Crowe, his character of Maximus, he's a general, he becomes a slave, he becomes a gladiator, and he eventually learns how to kind of game the system to take on the emperor and kill him in hand-to-hand combat, right? But he also dies, and so he loses his freedom, he loses his life, and he ultimately, you know, he ends up rejoining his wife and son. It's a somewhat aspirational story, but it's also kind of bleak, right? It's like you can't have freedom, you can't have happiness without the ultimate sacrifice. That's kind of like the biggest, you know, 10,000 foot view of what that picture kind of, I think, is trying to say. This film, it's very, very similar. It's playing along very similar lines, but it ends very differently. It's got a very different kind of conclusion, and I think it's ultimately trying to say something much different. In terms of those things are all, you know, freedom, happiness, family, love. Those are all things we should want and should fight for. And we should risk everything for them. But by risking that, I think it is possible to achieve it. But you have to be willing to do it. Just like it's the same sort of sacrifice to gain power and wealth and influence, right? And so we see these two characters on both ends of that spectrum doing that at the same time. And I think the film at least comes down on a more hopeful, more aspirational story altogether, because our character does survive and may live to see another day and to do other things. And, you know, does that open this up for a third film? I don't know. I kind of don't feel like that's necessary either. But in a way, I look at this film as like it's maybe a little bit of a do-over, because the first film it does really kind of end on a pretty cynical note. And this one, I think, takes a different approach. So, you know, I've seen a couple of things about some of the filmmaking in this for Ridley Scott, like a master, legendary filmmaker. Like, why does this feel a little bit below, you know, his level? And I could say that about, I guess, the last handful of films. You know, and it reminds me, I actually watched Napoleon, the director's cut, which I talked about in a previous episode a while back. And that is a film that, you know, I thought a director's cut with more footage, with more development of some of the scenes or some of the characters, I thought that would really help that. I remember thinking that at the time. It's in that episode. And yeah, that was me and my dad, I think, on that one. And, if you want to hear that, you can go to filmstreak.com. You can find that. But a big thing that it just felt like for both of us, it was like, it seems like there's some stuff that's been cut out. And for Ridley Scott, that's not unusual. A lot of his films are, earlier cuts, or there are longer cuts of them, and they get cut down, trimmed down for theatrical release or whatever. You could look at Blade Runner. You could look at Kingdom of Heaven. You could look at Black Hawk Down. You could look at, what else? Alien even. But I think ultimately the Napoleon film, I don't think it's helped by any of the additional footage. I mean, in a way, it almost felt worse. Because a lot of the scenes that I could spot that were longer or extended, they were involving more characters. And it was a lot of more kind of talking and showing us some things for context. But I think it just pointed out even more to me how hamstrung that film is by Joaquin Phoenix and his performance. Like, I could not see anybody besides Joaquin Phoenix. And I think that's a problem for that film. I talked about it at the time. It's just so distracting to me. And, whatever the choices or the reasons for those choices were, it doesn't do the film or the story any justice. But in terms of the film itself, aside from Joaquin Phoenix, here's the other thing, is that the director's cut, I feel like it had more scenes with Vanessa Kirby as Josephine. And this time around watching it, I felt like, oh, this is actually her film. Like, she really stands out in that film. I don't know why. Seeing it again, I guess because I was not so focused on the main character, but focused on Vanessa Kirby. I think she does more interesting work there. And I think that director's cut kind of helps flesh out her side of the story. And I think it just shows just how much better she is in it. And how much more important Josephine is to the story. So I don't know. That's my takeaway from the director's cut of Napoleon. I don't know that I'm going to ever have to watch those films again. I feel like there's still a longer cut, because I remember there was some mention of like a 4-hour version. I think I'm good. I don't think seeing it twice now has really helped it get any better in my mind, other than Vanessa Kirby. So anyway, those are most of the films that I saw this year that I just couldn't really maybe figure out how to put into another episode. But if you want to catch some other episodes of this podcast, you go to filmstreak.com. You can check out all the films there. You can find the list. I've got a list of all of these films, over 500. And I think with this episode, we're going to be over 550 now. You can find all these films on IMDb. You can see where to stream them, add them to your watch list, do that kind of thing. And so in the meantime, look, we're closing out 2024. So look, if you're done with your shopping, I hope, please, so like, why are we still doing that, right? Just order it online. And while you're doing that, while it's getting shipped to you, just watch something new.